and welcome to Oh God, What Now, the No Bullshit Politics podcast. I'm Andrew Harrison. We've had a brilliant response to our New Look Tuesday editions, where we step aside from day-to-day politics and instead go for a deep dive into bigger, wider topics. The editions on the real meaning of AI for our economy and our future, and on whether Trump could seek a third term, have had some of the best comments we've ever had while doing the podcasts. They are, as the young people say, evergreen episodes, so if you missed them, do go back and listen. Today, we tackle the big one, the vast consequences of the conflict in Gaza, triggered by Hamas's massacre on October the 7th, 2023, and then aggressively escalated by Benjamin Netanyahu. From the violent realignment of Iran's power to instability in Egypt and Jordan, from the humanitarian devastation in Gaza, famine, mass death and displacement and cultural destruction, to the horrific fate of Israeli hostages and the birth of a new global protest movement, the enormity of these years has been hard to take in. What will the long-term consequences be? Is there any end in sight to the horrors in Gaza? Or have Netanyahu's hardliners led Israel into a cul-de-sac of occupation and continuing violence? And is it possible to avoid wider regional escalation? Here to help us understand all this is a friend of the pod and a UCL professor of politics and international relations. She specialises in conflict, political violence, Middle East politics and foreign policy. She coordinates UCL's Israel-Palestine initiative, and she is the author of Gaza, The Dream and the Nightmare, which is published in October. Welcome back, Dr. Julie Norman.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
Good to have you here. Can you tell us a bit about UCL's Israel-Palestine initiative? Because reading around it, I think it's been a bit controversial.
Yeah, just a little bit, as things in this nature tend to be. So this is an initiative that we started shortly after October 7th, and it was really set up by student request to be a place where students from any or all backgrounds can come together to learn about and discuss the broader Israel-Palestine conflict from a lot of different perspectives. So we've had a lot of different speakers, different backgrounds, different opinions, different beliefs, often using very different terminology, and just trying to have a space where those kinds of conversations can happen.
Yeah, and it's been, there have been sort of student protests against it because it hasn't necessarily followed one particular analysis of, this is you've been accused of normalizing Israeli genocide.
Right, yes. So we've been accused of a lot of things, and I would say this is not uncommon in spaces like this. And I was well aware of that when we were starting this up. This might be the case. And for me, this is an initiative that, again, this is trying to meet a place where students needed a space like this. And we've had, comments from both sides that are trying to kind of push back at it. But we're pretty confident what we're doing, and there's a lot of positive support for it as well.
How do you negotiate being an objective academic when you're surrounded by very, very assertive voices on both sides insisting there's only one way of looking at this?
Yes, it's extremely challenging. And I recognize just the emotions that are laden in this conflict. And so it's one of those things where I recognize it's not going to be something for everybody. I try and meet students where they're at. I offer to have conversations with pretty much anybody and just say, look, we're trying to have a space where the basic ground rule is just please don't dehumanize each other. And we're just here to have a conversation, understand, even if you don't agree. Some people, that's not going to be enough. They're going to want a stronger stance. I appreciate that kind of activism. This is a adjacent kind of space for a different kind of theory of change.
Also with us today, taking time out from his holiday, because this is important stuff. It's Oh God, What Now regular and Guardian leader writer Raphael Burr. Hello, Raf.
Hi there, Andrew. And obviously this is what I'd be doing on my holiday anyway, talking about Israel-Palestine. What else might I be doing with my leisure hours?
Thinking about politics, yeah. I mean, it's regular listeners will know we've not done a huge amount on this topic on the podcast, simply because it kind of defeats us. We've often felt like there's just nothing we can add apart from, furthering the despair. You have to write leaders about it. Does it grind you down?
To be honest, yes. I mean, it's never been a subject I've enjoyed writing about, and I don't write about it often, not because I don't have necessarily things to say about it, but kind of for the reasons that Julie was just outlining. It's technically very difficult to articulate any sort of new or current analysis that doesn't plunge you into a really deep historical process of sort of pulling at the threads, and then you get back before you know it to 1948 and earlier, and there are so many these sort of the apparatus of the conflicting senses of right and wrong in this, even from the present moment, become historiographical controversies, and that just, if you've got 600 words to write it in, it's technically incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the hardest things to deal with is that there's no kind of seldom is there an agreed truth of exactly what's happened in a particular incident. Like we had this thing this week, the killing of the journalist Anas al-Sharif, along with 5 other people, sort of in and around a press tent in Gaza City. There's outrage that Israel's killed another journalist. Then we're told he's a member of Hamas, and here's this tweet of his celebrating October the 7th. Then here's further evidence that Israel kills journalists and then retrospectively designates them as Hamas members. And it's kind of like, it's part of the problem that people want a clear black and white take, and in an area of such tumult, it's never going to be clear in black and white.
Yeah, and certainly, I mean, particularly in the last year or two, this conflict has acquired this emblematic status in a broader sort of context of geopolitical ferment, where people feel that it's in a polarized set of arguments, it has become the tip of 2 very emotionally resonant polar arguments, which don't really work because it's for reasons that I hope we'll go into. It's incredibly complicated. I do think, I mean, on that particular case, it illuminates something that I'm afraid I find especially depressing, because I mean, sort of the argument that is a journalist sort of a Hamas asset and therefore kind of a military target. I mean, this was the argument that a terrorist would use to say, well, there's no innocent Israelis, right? Because somehow this is your government, you voted for it. So the fact that you're a democracy and you've created this system, you are therefore, even innocent person in the market getting blown up, you're sort of complicit in a crime. And so the logic of terrorism, which says there is no innocent Israeli, there is no innocent Palestinian, as an expression of a military campaign is deeply demoralizing at best. But and more in points to this other problem that you have, which is that Hamas can simultaneously be a terrorist organization and the organizing authority in Gaza for a long time, without whose cooperation or collaboration it would be very hard to get anything done. So I don't know. I mean, one thing I would add on this, which is good for context, although it might plunge us into the sort of philosophy and psychology in the deep end a bit early on in the conversation, is, and again, why I find it quite hard to write about these things and why it's so difficult, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of people, is because Israel Palestine touches on these much deeper questions of identity for a lot of people. So a lot of diaspora Jews have some kind of strong feeling or relationship with the idea of Israel. The plight of the Palestinians is woven through a lot of people's understanding of their Muslim identity and other historical grievances and sort of atrocities that have been committed. And whenever a political argument touches on something that's fused with your sense of identity, the natural psychological response is to feel it not as an analysis, but as an attack. And once you feel attacked, your kind of adrenaline fight or flight response gets activated, and you sort of respond with very, very defensively and very, very angrily. And it's just incredibly difficult for anyone who feels these issues are in some sense part of who they are to also say, well, I will analyze this the way I would analyze Brexit or a budget. And I think there's just an awful lot of people out there who are really struggling with that as they try and disentangle what's going on.
So we're going to start by concentrating on Gaza and Israel specifically, and then later in the show, we're going to look at the wider region. Julie, we are not even near the end yet. We can see what the war has done to Gaza, but is it yet possible to say what it has done to Israel as a state and as a democracy?
Yeah, I mean, the war has had a very devastating effect on Israel, too, I would say, in terms of its future trajectory as a democratic state. And I would note that even before October 7th, 2023, there were already massive protests in Israel about the state of democracy, at that time around something regarding judicial reform, but had really had people out in the streets for months around that. And the war has really just exacerbated what were already those tensions. I would say in Israel right now, there's just starting to be a bit more of a full anti-war movement. There's been a super, very large bring home the hostages movement for quite a while. There's now starting to be protests actually for Gazans against the war, and really putting pressure on the government for that too. But I would say for Israeli society right now, this question of where is Israel going? Is Israel becoming a pariah state, not only with its conduct in Gaza, but also with continuing operations in the West Bank as well? And what will this mean for Israel in the region and globally going forward?
Looking at the massive effects of October the 7th, it kind of struck me that Hamas had basically successfully pulled off a 9/11. You drag your enemy into a quagmire and you turn them into the monster you always claimed that they were. And it looks like Netanyahu is kind of obliged willingly. I mean, is that just kind of armchair ignorance on my behalf?
No, I think it's exactly spot on. I mean, the Hamas carried out the attack knowing there would be a response. I'm not sure if they knew quite the extent of what the response would be, but they did know that it would come, and they have used that to their advantage, I would say, and how they have spun things for their benefit as well. So this is something that they are drawing Israel into, and Israel has certainly exploited that opportunity, taken the initial response, and then carried it on to a much further extent than I think many people were thinking would happen.
Raf, as Julie was just alluding to, before the war, Israel was, riven with these protests. Liberal kind of, I guess the Israeli version of the Guardian reader is the Haaretz reader, terrified that Netanyahu and the far right are going to turn the place into a theocracy. Now, the distance of thousands of miles, I get the sense that even liberal Israelis and Jews around the world feel like that they're kind of on their own. Is that something that the war has also done, sort of like force Israelis to choose Netanyahu?
Up to a point, and only I think in the earliest stages. I think the contours of this are quite complicated and interesting. There was very clearly immediately after after October the 7th, there was, as there would be in any country, the rallying around the flag effect. But also on top of that, just in terms of the internal Israeli media coverage, obviously everything was about the hostages, everything was about what the response would be. And so as the campaign in Gaza became more and more violent and the death toll of Palestinians was going up, there was a sort of a horrible latency effect where Israeli society and Israelis weren't willing or able really to grasp what was actually happening there, because it involved turning a sort of, again, this sort of psychological convolution where you have to say, well, although we're the victims, now actually we're the perpetrators as well. And that's it just didn't really seem to be happening that much. There's evidence that that's shifting. I do think also, though, as that summer before October the 7th, when you had the protests about the judicial reforms, the extent to which Netanyahu, was perceived by liberal Israeli society with good reason as a crook and someone who's basically sort of dismantling Israel's democracy and was dangerous for the future of Israeli democracy. That doesn't just completely dissolve. I interviewed a Haaretz journalist called Amir Tibon, who he was in a kibbutz on October the 7th. He was spent the day in the safe room, literally listening to his neighbors being shot by marauding Hamas fighters. So he's not someone who's going to be sympathetic to Hamas, but he was very adamant in saying that it's such a trap if we all basically stop criticizing Netanyahu and stop holding him to account for his responsibility in dropping Israel's guard, getting the defensiveness wrong, having the absolutely catastrophically short-sighted strategy of thinking you could sort of let Hamas control Gaza because your defenses are so impregnable that actually that's a divide and rule strategy more widely to make a Palestinian state less viable. Ultimately, that Netanyahu needs to be held to account for that, and the longer he prolongs the war on his terms, the harder that is. And finally, again, that relates to this point about Jews elsewhere in the world and the diaspora. That's very complicated because, again, I think a lot of liberal Israelis would think, well, we're criticizing our government, so that's obviously a totally normal thing to do, and we can criticize it in the strongest possible terms. Why do even some liberal Jews outside Israel feel that they have to conflate supporting the idea of Israel and Israel's right to defend itself and the need to bring the hostages back with not criticizing the Netanyahu government, which is a far-right government which we liberal Israelis hate? And I think there is an element, this has created a certain element of guilt, I think, in diaspora Jews who sort of aren't in Israel, don't necessarily understand the society as much as they thought they did, and just sort of want to defend the idea of Israel, but then they find that just involves either not talking about Netanyahu or somehow sounding like apologists for Netanyahu. And my sort of final observation on this is that I think probably the conversations that Jews and Israelis have among themselves on all of these issues is going to be a lot more nuanced and a lot more critical of Israel and its government than they would have with anyone else. And I think that's probably true in all sorts of conflict situations. And actually, I mean, following on from that, with one question I would have for Julie on this is, because we're nearing 2 years into this, and to begin with, it was all configured from the Israeli perspective, obviously about getting the hostages back, making sure that nothing like October 7th could ever happen again. We now feel so far away from what a sort of a viable, attainable a short to medium term war aim would be. The latest move to essentially say, well, just Israel, wanting the IDF to take control of the whole of Gaza, and the IDF commander seemed to have some doubts about whether that's a good idea or not. What can we even say now about what an available short-term or medium-term war aim Israel has even is? Does that just I mean, that's where I feel a bit lost trying to understand the Israeli position.
Yeah, Raf, I think a lot of people are struggling with that right now. And I would say in some ways the war aims have changed, but in other ways not. I mean, if you look at what Netanyahu was saying in the days after October 7th, it was, yes, get the hostages back, but also destroy Hamas. And that meant different things to different people. And to military establishment people who I speak to in Israel, for them, that means depleting Hamas's military capabilities and to some degree governing capabilities. And from a military perspective, that's been done for over a year now. So the question is, what does destroy mean for Netanyahu? And that has since become disarming, completely surrendering from Hamas, and then also Israel keeping security control over Gaza. So essentially withholding some kind of presence in the Strip. And it's been really questionable what that would be. Would it be a full reoccupation? Would it be keeping a security presence in certain strategic corridors? Would it be setting up settlements again? And I think this is what everyone is trying to read Netanyahu right now to see what he is actually thinking. Because I will say these reoccupation of Gaza comments are not new. I was like, I just wrote a piece on this back in May when he said it then, and then everything kind of got overshadowed by the Iran war. And obviously now it's back again. So I think for Netanyahu and for many Israelis, there's this sense that even if the hostages are back, even if Hamas is not in charge, we still need some kind of control over Gaza. And the question is, what kind of control would that be? And of course, that would be the expense of Palestinian self-determination in the Strip at the same time.
And again, not wanting to get too deep into the weeds of Israeli domestic politics, but do the opposition have any kind of coherent answer to the question, well, what is the civilian population of Gaza supposed to do? Where are they supposed to go when the sort of the dominant narrative from the hard right that's driving the government policy is essentially a horrendous fiction about what is supposed to happen to those people? Crudely speaking, ethnic cleansing. That basically they become the problem of some other place, and Gaza isn't going to be their home anymore.
Yeah, I would say I think the opposition has really struggled to get any kind of legitimate, clear policy options on the table, and a lot of that has been for political reasons, in not wanting to look like you're against the hostages or against the war effort more broadly, or any kind of sympathy towards Hamas. But it's been really difficult for anyone in Israel to articulate a clear position on what should happen afterwards. And there's been polls done, and even from Israelis who are more centrist and even left-leaning, there's a real question mark as to what should happen with Gaza. And I think that's allowed Netanyahu to continue with some of these, more opaque policies of security control and kind of be able to get away with it, because it's been very difficult for anyone to offer an alternative.
The massive core question is obviously the incredibly emotive one. And many listeners will say, how can you even ask it? It's obvious what the answer is. You're an objective commentator. Does it fit the definition of a genocide?
I would say there's been a lot of moral weight attached to the word genocide, and I think that's why it has taken so much of our attention. In some ways, I think it's become a sort of litmus test on where one stands on Gaza, and perhaps has distracted from other questions about how to stop what is an absolutely appalling situation that is hands down unjustifiable under international law. So with that said, I do want to go into the case regarding genocide. I would preface this by saying I'm not an international lawyer. I work on Israel-Palestine, but I do teach on mass atrocities. And I would say there's a very strong case for genocide, and it should be litigated at the International Court of Justice as it is currently being done so, and that to do so is not anti-Semitic or even anti-Israel. I would differentiate between the colloquial use of the term genocide, just mass killing, and more the legal definition. So I'll kind of go through some of the legal definition points. The legal definition is tricky. In one way, I think it broadens our scope of what can fit under the genocide definition. It includes specific acts that go beyond the idea of systematic annihilation or extermination, which, in my view, is not what is happening in Gaza, though others would disagree with that. But it does list other acts that are, I would say, undeniably happening in Gaza. large-scale killing of civilians, large-scale injury, and probably most importantly for the Gaza case, this act of inflicting conditions of life to bring about destruction. So it's a bit weirdly worded, but it's pretty much this idea of destroying nearly all homes, arable land, water supply, controlling aid, these kinds of things, so making conditions of life. So those acts are certainly, I would say, being met in Gaza. I think, as most listeners know, though, those acts are not enough to warrant the genocide designation. Unfortunately, those acts happen in a lot of conflict zones and a lot of ones that I've worked in, from Myanmar, South Sudan, DRC, other places. You need to show that there is a intent to destroy the group, that those acts are being carried out with a clear intent to destroy a group of people. Proving that intent legally is very difficult. What normally we look to is comments, and for Israel, there are a lot of examples of genocidal rhetoric that has been used throughout the conflict, definitely in the days and weeks after October 7th, but also, I would say, up through today. Legally, though, that genocidal rhetoric does not necessarily link to intent. You have to have a clear line between that rhetoric and the actions on the ground, and that is what the court is going to be litigating. Our previous examples of genocide cases, courts tend to have a very high bar for that. And not only does there need to be intent, but it needs to be essentially the singular primary intent. So in a case like Gaza, it gets very murky because there are some, I would say, in Israel's leadership who have been espousing those views, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, names that people probably know. What the court will be trying to figure out is how wide that is, how much that extends across the war cabinet, across the military decision makers, and the actions on the ground. How much was it intent to destroy as opposed to intent to pressure Hamas for a ceasefire, intent to restore security, intent to restore deterrence, these kinds of things. So I would just say with that, I think the debate is going to go on for a long time, and the court won't decide for a while. And even after it decides, I think people will still discuss this. What I would just want to emphasize is that what is happening is unequivocally unjustifiable under international law. War crimes, crimes against humanity, we have other frameworks that already can say what is happening is completely unjustified. And for me, that indication there's a mass atrocity happen should galvanize us and bring out our moral outrage with or without the genocide designation.
So I know that some of our listeners will be sort of like looking at their whatever they play their podcast on and going, yes, it's complicated. Others will be shouting, how dare you? It's clearly a genocide. It's mass starvation. How can you possibly say that? And as you have said, not only does the question of is it or is it not a genocide polarize people, it becomes a substitute for dealing with the more complex aspect of it. So we spend more time arguing about whether it's a genocide or not a genocide, and not enough about how do you prevent mass starvation.
That's exactly right. I mean, to give the one example of one act is the siege, the complete, control over aid and humanitarian aid, not only food but also medical supplies, and that is a war crime, hands down. That is international, and moreover, we have seen the pictures. I have colleagues in the field. I mean, this is real and it is happening, and we should be galvanized to try and stop it. And I think waiting for whether it is definitely genocide or not is certainly going to be part of the conversation, but that should not distract us from actually trying to address what is happening right now.
And what if it is designated or adjudicated to be a genocide? What then happens? What powers can be brought into play?
Yeah, so one thing that makes genocide different than some other categories of international law is the convention requires states to act to prevent or to punish genocide. So it suggests that states would be taking some kind of action in those regards. I will note, however, that we've had numerous cases where there have been a genocide determination and those things don't happen, and other cases where there hasn't been and they do. So it's not quite as determinative as I think people often think it is, but that's why I think there's often this sense of if we just get that designation, people will do something.
Delegitimizing and isolating Israel was pretty clearly amongst Hamas's goals for the whole thing, backed by Iran. Has Netanyahu effectively helped them to achieve that particular goal, that Israel is now more isolated in the world?
I think it's certainly one of the big criticisms that liberal Israelis would put, on Netanyahu, that essentially he, through his actions, through the way he's clung to power, using this far right coalition for fear of one day being held to account for not just his mishandling of the security situation, but also corruption and various other things he's done. He is actually a threat to the security and integrity of Israel, because he is driving it into this position of international isolation. So I think that's one way of looking at the argument. I think it is also the case that Israeli policy, for going back a long time, has always had an element of, look, no one's going to understand our history. No one really cares, with this added layer of, and also, frankly, somewhere in the background, there's all sorts of anti-Semitism that might be under the surface. But essentially, I mean, it's perhaps an inappropriate metaphor for this conversation, but the kind of Millwall strategy, right? No one likes us, we don't care. The only government that really matters is the United States. And so, from that point of view, is this just a more radical and extreme iteration of that kind of foreign policy bullishness, stubbornness, and often self-defeating intensity? Kind of, yes. I do think also it's worth remembering in this context. I mean, it sounds like a sort of facile point, but it's actually quite important how incredibly small Israel is geographically, and then which is out of all proportion to how much military power it wields in the region, because then you get this sort of strange tension where Israel is sort of seen as a sort of local superpower and conceives itself as incredibly vulnerable and liable to be not just sort of threatened by things like October the 7th or the previous wars that have happened in Israel's history, but to the total sort of eradication and annihilation from the face of the earth. And just the final point on this, I mean, this idea of sort of delegitimizing Israel, and we haven't used the Z word yet in this conversation, and please God, let's not go too far down that rabbit hole, but the idea that there is still a kind of contingency around the whole Zionist project in a lot of people's eyes, and the idea that maybe 1947-48 was a mistake and actually shouldn't have happened, and the idea that the foundation, from the river to the sea, that the foundation of a Palestinian state would necessarily require the eradication of Israel, means a conversation about, oh, well, has the Israeli government really got on the wrong side of international opinion, has this turbo boost of existential dread woven into it for a lot of Israelis and a lot of Jews, that what you're really saying is, well, maybe Israel probably shouldn't be an actual country, we can just get rid of it. And so it's very hard to navigate what is sort of unhinged far-right Israeli foreign policy and what is that wider psychological apparatus of how vulnerable Israel feels as an entity in a lot of people's minds.
Well, I mean, the emergence of the massive global movement that I mentioned earlier against the war, it's clearly a mix of a lot of very sincere people who are horrified at the killings, and you can absolutely understand that. There's a lot of old school political anti-Israel types who come at it from either a kind of revolutionary politics angle or a identity politics angle, and anti-imperialists and so on. And in there are undoubtedly very visible anti-Semites who are often the most conspicuous people we see in these protests. In a lot of ways, it feels like it's become the animating cause for people in the West of the kind of further left and center left, and certainly, in universities. How does this bode for like a post-war future if we're going to go into a future where a lot of people's defining experience has been protesting against the activities of an Israeli government, which they're being told by many people on the march that they're on, is the entire Zionist project?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult to envisage the future in the Middle East, in the wider apparatus, at all without it feeling quite bleak. I mean, I suppose when I try and unpick this in my head, the closest analogy I can get to in terms of, as you say, how the protests against what's happening in Gaza have become part of a radical and even I'd say a broader sort of centre-left identity, a social justice emblem. It's sort of the role that the anti-apartheid movement had in the 70s and 80s. And what's interesting there, of course, is it comes back to this question of, well, is the demand that Israel stop killing innocent civilians sort of fused, or how far is it fused with some idea that actually maybe you should scrap Israel altogether because Zionism was a historical wrong turn, or an extension of capitalist imperialism in the sort of radical left sort of conception of it. And that in the in the anti-apartheid era. And then again, there's another whole set of very complicated arguments as to whether Israeli policy towards Palestinians and Arab Israelis is apartheid, and let's not go there. But just more broadly, that was a slightly different argument because no one was saying, well, basically, South Africa shouldn't exist. But there was a sense that at some point there's going to be a sort of a moral or a demographic push that means that the whole regime, the whole of South African society is going to completely change. And it's very hard to see, that I think a lot of people who are currently on university campuses will, in whatever the future conflicts are, whatever their future left politics are going to be, that their worldview will have been shaped in the crucible of this moment, I think.
The Israeli hardliners kind of reflexive move of branding all of the protesters as anti-Semites, and the Trump administration has certainly turbocharged this by disappearing people off campus for writing editorials and so forth. It just seems insanely counterproductive because, not least because it devalues actual, real, clearly visible anti-Semitism. What do you think? What's it doing to the state of, the way people in the West see the situation?
Oh, there's so much bad faith involved in a lot of the argument. And so, just to start with the simple bit, I mean, when people in the Trump administration talk about anti-Semitism, when their political movement has raided pockets of white supremacism and far-right ideology for support, and there's adjacent to that in all sorts of ways, and it feels so spectacularly cynical and dishonest. When the ideological firmament of Trumpism includes this sort of great replacement conspiracy theory, which is deeply anti-Semitic. So that is deeply frustrating and demoralizing. But if you sort of get beyond that, again, it's one of these situations where you have to be able to hold multiple apparently contradictory things in your head at the same time, because I think it must be simultaneously true that because for centuries, Western civilization has had a certain conception of Jewish identity and Jewish power, Jewish culture that's sort of steeped in sort of anti-Semitic tropes, and then that sort of then merges with the anti-Israel as a sort of foreign policy and as a political thing that happens in the Cold War in particular, and subsequently, which means that kind of inevitably some of the ways in which Israel is attacked and accused of doing certain things will cross into a kind of vilification that contains anti-Semitic tropes, right? So this idea that it's the most extraordinary power pulling on the puppet strings of all of international affairs, or that there is a particular bloodthirstiness that makes Israel sort of wallow in the blood of children, killing children, that has this sort of connotations of a blood libel. So it sort of stimulates antibodies in a lot of your Jewish audience that thinks this is anti-Semitism. It feels like anti-Semitism, and that can be a very sincere response in them. They think, well, actually, they feel, as I said at the top, their identity is being attacked. While it is also true that for a lot of people who are making those accusations, they're just saying that we're seeing what's happening on the news. We're observing the facts here, what the IDF is doing, and how many people are being killed, and how many of them are children. And we're just telling the facts like that, and we're expressing entirely normal, moral, righteous anger about that. And it's really, as I think is pretty clear from the fact that I've been sort of rambling on about it for about the last 3 minutes, it's very, very difficult to disentangle those.
Julie, how weakened are Hamas and Hezbollah by this? Because by certain estimates, Hamas has lost 17,000 fighters, 80% of Gaza territory. Hezbollah has lost, senior commanders. The IDF claims that about 70 to 80% of its firepower infrastructure have been destroyed. Has purely within terms of the original war aim, how weakened are they?
Yes, I would say both Hamas and Hezbollah have been extremely weakened in the wars and the conflicts. So for Hamas, it's estimated that probably between 80 to 90% of their fighting force has been targeted and killed by Israel. And so that's very significant. What I would point out, though, is that Hamas has not really struggled to recruit because of the situation, and that does not have the same military implications for Israel in terms of a military threat. But what it does mean is that Hamas can carry on a low-intensity guerrilla war, insurgency-style operations for pretty much indefinitely within the Strip. And I would point out that they're often using unexploded Israeli ordnance that is still lying around Gaza to do that. And so I believe that movement can sustain for quite a while. And all Hamas needs to do is not surrender to have victory. And just the fact that they are still kind of standing and still doing stuff makes them, that is victory enough for them. And so it's going to be very hard, I think, to ever have them completely say, we're out. I would say Hezbollah is a little bit different. Hezbollah, listeners may know, is the armed group that's been based in southern Lebanon for the last several decades. It was the target of an Israeli operation back in the fall that started with a very highly sophisticated attack through pagers and then carried on into more typical warfare and airstrikes. Hezbollah has been very, very depleted militarily, financially, as well as in terms of their leadership. A lot of their previous sources came from Iran, which is also very weak right now, and from Syria, which has had the regime change. So Hezbollah is in a situation where their own government right now is trying to, the Lebanese government and armed forces are trying to fully disarm Hezbollah. So that is a major shift for an actor that was seen as the primary existential threat to Israel pre-October 7th.
Can I jump in here with a question, Julie, about this, going back to the point that Netanyahu was, as I understand it, quite complicit in the Qatari funding of Hamas. So understanding that if you sort of isolate Hamas, you let them have their Gaza enclave, that's separate from the Palestinian Authority. That makes any functional talk of a two-state solution incredibly difficult, just because there's no united Palestinian operation. That obviously hugely backfired. But this feeling that Netanyahu now is, and again, because he's got this slightly fragile coalition situation, he's dependent on the far right. It's a horrible thing to contemplate, but he's essentially reliant now, it seems to me, on perpetual war and the ongoing perpetual threat of Hamas for his own domestic political advantage and survival. Is that a sort of a fair analysis of where he's sort of stuck?
Yeah, I would say that is definitely the analysis from many people who I spoke with in Israel, and I would say from my own also, is that Netanyahu is trying to extend the war as long as possible. Israel will need to have elections by next October, so October 2026. But I think he is in a position where he's trying to string it out as much as possible until then. And that's partly for trying to avoid any kind of investigations into what happened on October 7th and the failings of himself and the state regarding that. It's in regards to other corruption trials going on around him. And really, most importantly, I think, and just as how he sees that he will be able to go into the next election and keep his current coalition somewhat together. And so he's been always in this toggling point between trying to placate the very far right parties that prop up his coalition, and then occasionally abiding a bit by what the U.S. wants or what the international community is asking, but especially the U.S. But it's really this sense of trying to walk this middle line, and that means keeping the war going. And I would emphasize too, part of that comes back to what you asked before, in that there really is not a clear day after plan for Gaza, and Netanyahu has not really entertained any clear plan for day after stuff in Gaza. But because of that, I think he sees it easier to have a war situation where you can have Israeli presence on the ground than try and figure out what comes next.
Because we've got Julia here today, we thought we should get some specific questions for her from you, the listeners, for our But Your Emails feature, rather than having me and Raf just swerve off to talk about MasterChef and culture wars and things. Remember, you can always email your questions to info@romaniacs.com, our old-fashioned email address. All are welcome. We've got a handful of questions from the Patreons. This is Richard Beach. Who does Dr. Norman think actually has the capacity to take over the running of Gaza that could be acceptable to the Gaza population, Israel, and the international community? Does such a competent authority exist yet? And he also says, for context, I'm a woke lefty Zionist Jew with connections to family of hostages and to families of individuals murdered on the 7th of October, but my heart goes out to all those affected by the horror on all sides.
I would say this is the golden question, and I would say from my conversations in the region, at least from a Palestinian perspective, as much as people can't stand the Palestinian Authority, as much as they see it as weak, corrupt, what have you, they see it as kind of the worst option, except for all the others, to take over Gaza, at least in some kind of technocratic form, in some kind of reformed, revamped kind of way. That is where I think the Americans, at least initially, were putting their support as well. And historically, where I think Israel would have been okay with it, but currently, under the current Netanyahu government, that is a non-starter. So we are very stuck right now into what kind of authority could take over in the Strip. But I would say the ones that Netanyahu is putting forward, essentially local clan leaders, are not seen acceptable by Palestinians. So we are at this impasse.
John Penny, this is probably one for you, Raf. John Penny asks, the British left seem determined to make the UK take responsibility for the ongoing situation in Gaza. Can it realistically be described as Britain's fault? Is there anything our government could do which would make any material difference to the Israeli government, or would more condemnation or export restrictions be empty gestures?
Look, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I sometimes find it frustrating how much agency the protesters, particularly when they accuse sort of Keir Starmer of something, demand that Keir Starmer answer charges in the International Criminal Court and stuff. You think that is a very roundabout way to try and get justice for Palestinians, and I don't think it's probably the most efficient one. Ultimately, the answer is only through America. This is like, to the extent that the UK has leverage, it has leverage. Either as part of a concerted European action, or what leverage the UK has in foreign policy with the Trump administration obviously makes that even harder with Washington. But for reasons that we've discussed before, ultimately the non-Israeli government that can change the way Israel behaves is in Washington. It's not in Europe, and it's not in London.
And if I can just say, too, one Israeli I spoke to just a week or two ago was saying for them, when the UK comes out with statements, it's like the old cartoon English policeman running down the street blowing a whistle at kids, but not really be able to do anything. And he said that's how we see the UK, as kind of this whistleblower, but not really able to do much. So I would agree with what Raf said, that it's really in consolidated effort with Europe, with many other Western actors, and or leverage with the US that the UK can have an impact.
One for you, Julie, here from Alex Sowden. Is it correct that the reason the UK and other European nations choose not to sanction Israel or speak out against the IDF's murderous onslaught on Gaza is because Western security agencies depend on Israeli intelligence for important information about the entire Middle East region, including both Saudi Arabia and Iran?
So I would say in recent weeks, at least, I think we have seen a big change in the extent to which European states are willing to criticize Israel. They have been very forthright in their declarations, and then now with the recognition, which I do think matters. So I do think we're seeing a shift there. And I would point out also the UK, did change its arms exports conditions last year, and even Germany is reviewing that kind of thing now. So those changes are coming. But yes, you're right that there are very long-standing intelligence coordination. There is long-standing security coordination in the region between Western powers and Israel, and that's one reason I think why states are reluctant to go full in with sanctions and other kinds of punishments to Israel.
And just finally, we've got some really good questions here. It's a shame we can't do all of them. Claire Nick asks, how can we avoid another cycle of violence setting itself up in 20 years' time when the young people of Gaza who lived through this come of age and maybe want to seek retribution? What can the UN or other international bodies do to support the Palestinians and Israelis to break the cycle?
So I do think what is happening now in terms of recognizing a Palestinian state matters. It doesn't change things right away, but it's also not an empty gesture. It does help reset the sequencing for keeping a two-state solution somewhat on the table and allowing for there to be more symmetry if and when those negotiations take place. I think the international community could be doing much more to support pragmatic actors in both communities who are trying to keep channels open, who are working for real changes and are actually trying to do very good work. And there's many, many people doing that on the ground. And I think finally trying to amplify the moderate political voices in both communities as well. There's a lot of talented young people coming up. They feel very kind of repressed in their current systems, but they want to have a voice, and Europe can help them get that.
Just briefly, finally, we've got to look at the consequences of the war in the wider region. Before October the 7th, Julie, there seemed to be a bit of a sense in the Arab and Middle East world that Palestine was kind of like a nuisance issue that was going nowhere. The war has certainly put Palestine right back at the forefront of the Arab world. What does that mean?
Yeah, so obviously, Palestine, I think, was seen as a bit of a back issue, and especially listeners might remember at the end of Trump's first term, he brokered in something called the Abraham Accords, which was essentially several Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, normalizing relations with Israel. Palestinians really saw that as a slap in the face, as really sidelining their cause and normalizing relations without a pathway. So many believe that's one impetus for the October 7th attacks was to force, if you will, Palestine front and center, not only for the world, but for Arab states. And I think it has done that. A big question with all that right now is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was one other state that Israel, the U.S., many regional actors were thinking was going to be the next state to normalize relations with Israel. Saudi's position has since been, we will normalize if there is recognition of a Palestinian state from Israel, or at least a pathway to that. So I would say those conversations, I think incredibly, have not completely gone off the table. And I do think if or when we get out of the current crisis with Gaza, that is where things will likely pick up for any kind of long-term change.
I'm fascinated by the Saudi role in this, particularly in relation to Iran, actually, because I read some analysis, and there is this idea that because obviously and historically Saudi Arabia and Iran are the sort of rival cultural, historical, and economic and military powers vying for primacy in the Middle East, separate to, and the one thing they have in common is this animosity to Israel historically. But there was a feeling when you had the most recent, the strikes to take out the Iranian nuclear facilities, the US joining in, that certainly from Saudi and other Gulf states, an element of not necessarily being that sorry to see Iran put a little bit back in its box, particularly on the nuclear issue. And so I just wonder to what extent do you think Iran really has been strategically set back in the region by that particular micro war that happened, and whether it's fair to say that Saudi isn't necessarily that sorry when Israel and the US basically put Iran back in its box.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I will say Iran very weakened after this last war over the summer, not only their nuclear capabilities, but also a lot of their more conventional defense capabilities. And also it just underscored just the complete holes in their own intelligence and security kind of apparatus. So Iran definitely on the back foot right now, to the extent that at least some in the government are considering kind of entering negotiations again. I think that will still be playing out. But you're right, Raf, also. I mean, Iran and Saudi Arabia were kind of jockeying for a while as kind of superpowers in the region. There was some rapprochement between them, even kind of pre-Gaza and pre this last war. But right now, I think Saudi, like a lot of the Gulf states, they want stability. They want Iran and its proxies, as they're often referred to be somewhat quieted, and they want to be able to kind of move on into a new kind of era. And I would just add too, I mean, Saudi Arabia really led this declaration several weeks ago in which all Arab League states called on Hamas to disarm to enable a pathway to a Palestinian state. And that was major in the region. And it really shows to me that there's, to me, an unprecedented moment where most of the world, most of the region is kind of ready for this. But it's the key actors on the ground who are just still so mired in this situation in Gaza. But there's a regional shift that is taking place.
We could talk for another hour about the effects of this around the world, but maybe that's the subject for another podcast. But I just want to wrap up by asking both of you. I'm not going to ask you to predict how this is going to end, because we don't even seem to have like the vague contours of an end in sight, but trying to take this perspective of, maybe 10, 20, 50 years ahead, what do we think the long-term effects of this episode are going to be? I mean, has it changed the trajectory of what's happening in the region permanently, Julie?
I think it absolutely has, partly for the reasons we were just saying. The region around Israel-Palestine specifically has changed massively, and largely because of kind of side operations to what's happening there. And moreover, this would just be such an inflection point for Palestine and Israel. And we are so deep down the hole of that inflection point right now that it's hard to see a way out. But any other time in this conflict where there has been any kind of pivot, any kind of progress, it's been after a low point like this. So the more optimistic part of myself hopes that in the long durée, this will be seen as an inflection point when many actors internally as well as around the world said this cannot go on as it has been. We need a new way of thinking about this.
Ralph, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the time frame, a useful sort of point in the future to maybe try and imagine looking back from would be, because we're only about sort of 25, 26 years away from the centenary of the creation of the State of Israel. And I think it's really useful always with these things just to remember what a recent country it is, and how all of these problems, this whole conflict sort of emerges from that, post-war 1947, 1948, and can you conceive of a world in which the centenary of the celebration, commemoration, or for some people mourning of the creation of the State of Israel happens at a time where Israel is still a normal functioning democracy? There are other democracies in the region. A two-state solution is being discussed in a meaningful way, and there's some kind of framework, and there's a Palestinian leadership that Israel feels able or willing to engage with in pursuit of that. I mean, there's a lot of things that have to come together to make that possible in the next 25 years. I don't want to say it's not going to happen. I would say that election in Israel next year is, I mean, it's a cliche, but it's really hard to overstate how important that is, because if through that campaign and in the result of that election, you get some sense that Israeli society is understanding how self-harming, how self-delegitimizing the Netanyahu approach to this is and has been, then you can see a little portal opening up to that slightly more optimistic future that I outlined.
We've come to the end of the show, and it's usually where we do escape routes, and we thought this has been such a grim and heavy edition that maybe we shouldn't do it. But then we thought, yes, we should do it, because you do need to take your mind off things sometimes. So we are going to ask Julie and Raf, what are the books, films, music, and or TV that they've been using as emotional bolt holes from politics in the past few weeks? Julie.
Yeah, so I will go old school. I'm a huge Bruce Springsteen fan. And speaking of anniversaries, this is the 50th anniversary of the Born to Run album being released, which is just an absolutely fabulous album, put Springsteen on everyone's radar. But this title track is obviously awesome, but listen to the album, the opening track, the ending track. It's one of the tightest albums I think he's ever released and one of the best albums of all time. So I go there.
Well, you live in London where the highways are jammed with broken heroes on a last-chance power drive on a daily basis. So that's very, very fitting. Raf Bear, what's your escape route?
It's a non-fiction book, but it's not about politics. It's definitely not about the Middle East. No, it's a book by an old colleague of mine, actually, when I worked at New Statesman. Helen Lewis has written a book called The Genius Myth. And it's all about our modern concept of what makes great art or great science, what is a genius, and how it evolved from through the Renaissance and the Romantic era, and really debunking the idea that there are sort of special, extremely gifted people who, first of all, exist in isolation from the society that they're in, and also are allowed to behave like absolute tosspots because somehow, and a lot of them are men. Guess what? And a lot of the assumptions around them are very male, gender coded. And Helen writes really well and wittily, but also with erudition. And it's every now and again you get one of those non-fiction books where you think, well, yeah, sort of obviously someone needed to write the book going, hang on a second, what is a genius? This is all bollocks, basically. Like, this is obviously a lot, okay, Shakespeare, amazing, Titan and everything. But right. Yeah, there aren't that many of those sorts of people. And even then, how much did they express their context and all these other things? And I'm just really enjoying that as a lively debunking of all sorts of things that exist in a discourse without you necessarily realizing that they have absolutely no foundation in culture, history, science, or fact.
I cling to the idea that genius is a load of nonsense, like a man on a piece of driftwood in a raging sea. It's the only thing that keeps me going. My choice for escape routes is Alien Earth on Disney Plus. Of course it is. It would have to be. On Alien Earth is the TV series extension of the Alien franchise story, whatever. It's put together by Noah Hawley, who did Legion, which is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. An adaptation of a minor Marvel character, Legion on FX. You've got to watch it. On Alien Earth, the pretext is very simple. A spacecraft with the alien, the one, the chest burster, crashes on Earth. This is the last thing we wanted to happen. And it crashes on an Earth that is controlled by oligarchies. That there's the Weyland-Yutani company, which you may know from Alien, was involved in the original Alien movie, trying to like capture the xenomorph. It turns out, and it is almost impossible to believe this, but in the future, the Earth is going to be ruled by Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk types with SovCorp founder-led oligarchies. And I think we are working up to a message that the dominant life form in the universe is destructive parasitism. Either it's exploding out of your chest or it's taking control of your data and living on top of your society. I think this is what we're getting to. It's very, very exciting. It's extremely violent. Friend of the podcast, Michael Smiley, is in it. It's on Disney, and it's just fantastic. And I can see Raf doing a slightly incredulous face at me.
Yeah, I was going to say, and this is a relief from the horrible dystopian reality we're existing in right now.
The idea that a chest-bursting alien with acid for blood and teeth on the end of its tongue is actually a much nicer thing.
Could win a presidential election if it had the right resources behind it. Yes, obviously. I mean, like, what's not?
Many people are saying it's the best alien. It's a very good alien. They call it with tears in their eyes. They say, "Sir, you're the best alien." And that's the end of our show. Thank you to Dr. Julie Norman.
Always a pleasure.
There is a buy link to Julie's new book, Gaza, the Dream and the Nightmare, in the show notes, so you can pre-order it. And you are released to go back on your holidays with your bucket and spade, Raphael Bear.
Thank you very much.
Listeners, we hope you've enjoyed our new deep dives at the start of the week. Well, enjoyed might be a bit of a strong word. We hope you've got something out of it. We are covering day-to-day politics as usual on the Friday edition, so don't forget to subscribe. And of course, if you back us on Patreon, you'll get it on Thursday. You'll get it early. You'll get that as well as the irreplaceable good feeling of supporting independent podcasts. Follow the link in the show notes to find out how to back us on Patreon. Don't forget, if you've got questions for the pod about anything at all, then send them to info@romaniacs.com. You might make but your emails. And if you have a moment in your busy schedule to give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app, then please do. It really helps. Thanks for listening. We hope you found this episode interesting and useful. And we'll see you at the end of the week.